Hey everyone, I'm Michael. I have finished reading the Rainbow Magic Fairy series. I've read all 175 books. I think that's how many books are in this series. So, that's a lot of books. I didn't want to do a recap video where I explain what happens in every single book because that would take me forever. So I'm just doing this video where I talk directly to the camera and, I'll just talk about anything that comes into my mind with the Rainbow Magic Fairy series. It took me about 4 years to read all the books. I read them out loud to my daughter. And, the books aren't long. They're like 60 pages each. The main problem is that they're just boring. They're really boring and repetitive and predictable. If you've read one of these books, you've basically read them all. So, yeah. The earlier part of the series is better. The first, 30 to 50 books. I think those are the best books in the series. When you reach the ending part of the series, they just repeat each other a lot. So, magical animals. There's a magical animals series. It's the Pet Fairy series. And it's okay, but then they have another magical animal fairy series. And then another. And that's what it's like when you're at the end of the series. It's like they just keep repeating these old series. It's like, okay, another animal series. Oh, another food-based series. Ugh. And gosh, it was bad. So the first 30 to 50 books are better in that, they're not blatantly reusing previous series. They're still relatively fresh and new. I say relatively fresh and new because they're not completely fresh and new. Like even here, Cherry the Cake Fairy, it's just repeating stuff from previous series. All right, maybe I should back up. So the first 7 books are the Rainbow Magic Fairies, and they are probably the best books in the series. They're more different than what we get later on. So like the first book, Ruby the Red Fairy, it's like all backstory actually, and that's kind of different. And then book number 2 is the goblin shows up, and the goblin's the big bad, and the goblin's actually like a legitimate threat in this series. And interestingly enough, like book number 5, is it 4? No, 4. So one of the problems with the series is the books aren't numbered. There's no numbering system to the books, which is a huge pain. Okay, that's a big problem. I said there were 175 books in the series. That's not quite accurate because some of the series were not released in the United States. Like the Showtime fairies, I think, were not released in the United States. And I think maybe the helper fairies, like the paramedic fairy and the firefighter fairy, I don't think those were released in the United States either. That's another common thing for fairies. It's jobs. We see that a lot more in the special edition series. So there are about like 50 books in the special edition series. So a lot of holiday fairies, a lot of Christmas fairies. There are like 8 different Christmas fairies. And a lot of fairies that are based on jobs. So here's the vet fairy, here's the doctor fairy, and here's the firefighter fairy, and so on. So the special editions, they are like 3 books in one, and that's a lie, really, because these books are all 6 chapters each, and then these books, the special editions, they are made up of 3 5-chapter parts. It's not 6 chapters. It's not a full book in one. They keep saying, oh, we're 3 books in one. No, they're not. They are not. And they waste so much time with these books because it's in 3 parts. And so in between every part, we have to get a blank page. And then part 2, the part where nothing interesting happens. And then another blank page. And then a table of contents just for that part. And then another blank page. It's like 4 or 5 pages, which is just a complete waste in between every single part, when they easily could have just not split up the book into 3 parts. They could have easily just had a single table of contents at the beginning of the book. But no, they inflate the page count to make it seem like the book is a lot longer than it actually is. And that's not something I liked. It kind of ruined the pacing. Okay, I'm getting a little too intense here by saying, oh, they're ruining the pacing. The pacing is not so great in this series, trust me. So generally, what happens is here's your standard fairy book. I'm gonna describe over 100 books in the series, right? Get ready. So chapter number 1, Rachel and Kirsty recap what happened in the previous book. And chapter number 2 is usually they notice something's wrong because the fairy magic, the missing fairy object of the day is missing, right? And that's something which really annoys me, especially with the food books, are, the books that are super heavy on recap. So it's like, okay, like, I'll give the food books as an example. Like, okay, in the apple book, all the apples tasted bad because of the fairy magic. In the orange book, all the oranges tasted bad because of the fairy magic. And now it's the banana book, and Rachel and Kirsty just spent 10 pages talking about how all fruit tastes bad now because of the fairy magic. And yet in chapter 2, they are still shocked and surprised that bananas don't taste good. Which is just... They were just talking about it. And we just read about it 2 books. It's like, don't you remember what happened in the last 2 books? Just even going beyond that, it's like, don't you remember how this happened in the last 30 to 40 books? Quit doing the same thing over and over. Quit pretending it's a surprise. Gah! Okay. Sorry, getting a little over emotional. Chapter 3, they usually meet the fairy of the day. Chapter 4, the goblin shows up. They see a goblin, and guess what? The goblin has the magic item, the fairy's magic item. Like in Cherry the Cake Fairy, I don't know what it was. Like a cherry, maybe a cake spoon. Some of the fairy magic items, some of them make sense. Some of them don't, okay? Let's see what Holly the Christmas Fairy has. So she has 3 magic presents. Okay, she's a Christmas fairy. That makes sense. That makes sense. But just some of their items are just so random and don't make sense. Anyway, I'm summarizing the book. Chapter 4, they defeat the goblin. They come up with some sort of trick to stop the goblin. And then chapter 6, they see that things are now back to normal because the fairy magic has been recovered. Hooray! And that's it. That is like 150 books of this series. I just described 150 books. I'm sorry, I know I went on a big tangent in the middle, so let me just repeat that. Chapter 1, they recap the book. Chapter 2, they see... basically, Chapter 1, they recap the series and what's going on. Chapter 2, they realize things are bad because of fairy magic. Chapter 3, Fairy of the Day shows up. Chapter 4, the goblin shows up. Chapter 5, they defeat the goblin. Chapter 6, everything goes back to normal. That's the formula. They just repeat that every single book. Now, there are some small changes. Now, did I say, like, the first, 50 or so books are good? I'm not going to say they're good, but they're better because they tried more things with the formula. They changed the formula a little bit. So, and they also tried to have different locations. Like, there was for a while there, it was like every book had to have its own unique location. And they all tried to be, like, different, interesting locations. Like, oh, in this book we're going to the lighthouse. And in this book we're going to a college. And in this book we're going to the theater. Stuff like that. It kept it a little bit fresh and interesting. But later on in the series, it's just boring because they go to the same place over and over and over again. Like, I'm thinking of, I think the Fairy Tale Fairies series, where they go to a festival. Like, they're at the festival. Also, the Festival Fairies series. It's the same location every single time. At least the early books tried to switch it up instead of having them visit the exact same location in every single book, which just made it worse. Some of the books also tried to introduce subplots, like, something's going on with Kirsty's grandmother. And then at the very end, because the fairy magic is returned, her grandmother succeeds. That's pretty basic, but that's at least a bit more interesting than your typical chapter 2, which is things are bad because of fairy magic, you know. But it also didn't work. After a while, it just got so stale and formulaic, and you know, you'd only see the character who has the problem in chapter 1 or chapter 2, and that character was never well developed. It's like, oh, Rachel says, oh, here's my friend, and the friend barely appears in the book. We come back to the friend at the end of the book. It leaves no impression on me whatsoever. I barely remembered the friend, completely forgot what the friend was like. That did not work. Yeah, but, you know, points for trying. Let's see, there was, I'm thinking of the Baby Animal Rescue Fairy series where they do the setup where the girls are at camp, and they're at helper camp, and then each day they're helping something in the woods. So, like, one day they have to count the animals, and then one day they have to clean up the messy road. And then at the end of the book, the fairy comes and fixes the problem for them. But that was okay-ish. Okay, so here's what happened was, generally that story took up like 2 to 3 chapters. It varied from book to book. And so that was like half the book, which, you know, I think it worked in some cases, and then other cases it just didn't work to have half the book kind of be recap and the boring stuff at home that doesn't really affect the fairy magic stories. Okay. There were some changes to the formula. So with the like early 50 books, always book number 1, the girls go to fairyland and they meet the fairies. They meet all the fairies, and then Jack Frost shows up and does bad stuff. And that was usually different. Also, every book 7 had Jack Frost in it. We had a big Jack Frost finale where he tried to stop the girls. And that was usually different and interesting because it's different. So the first and last book of the series was always interesting and different just because it's not the exact same thing as the other 5 books. The other 5 books are just carbon copies of each other. But a trip to Fairyland and Jack Frost appearing for a big scary finale, that was good and generally made those books interesting. So the first and last books of the series generally were the best. Jack Frost was kind of dangerous and scary, and as the series went on, he just became a joke. And he acted just like a goblin. He's just a slightly taller goblin. That's it. Which, you know, you go back and read the earlier books where he's like throwing around lightning bolts and he's a legitimate threat. It's like, what happened to him? He just became a joke. Yeah. I think at some point somebody realized that the Jack Frost books were more interesting, and so they tried to like have one Jack Frost book, an extra Jack Frost book in every series, and that worked okay, relatively okay. I feel like the series was put in a bad place because every series had 7 books, right? Because the first series was the Rainbow Magic series, and there are 7 colors in the rainbow. And it definitely feels like the series would have been better if it was 6 books per series. That's what I would say. Because every 6 books we have a different theme. Like we've got the party fairies, and then the candy fairies, and the weather fairies, and the music fairies, and the dance fairies. Those were very similar, in my opinion. Yeah. So I feel like a lot of those series would have benefited from only being, you know, 6 books long instead of 7. Days of the Week Fairy. I think those were really good, as were the Petal Fairies. Yeah, I seem to recall those were good ones. The fairies themselves are just really bad. They have no personality whatsoever. They're just, I'm a generic happy fairy. Oh no, Rachel and Kirsty, will you help me? And yeah, that's it. She basically comes to the girls and whines at them until the girls solve her problems. Yeah, I did like the fairies who were different and had new personalities. I think there were less than 10 of those. And that's something I liked about early on in the series. They kind of tried a bit more to give the fairies personalities, but then at some point they just threw up their hands and said, you know what, who cares? So Inky, the indigo fairy, she's like the only one who has her unique personality out of the first like 7 fairies. And I did watch the Rainbow Magic Fairy movie. It completely ignores the events of books 8 through 175. It completely ignores most of the series. It only focuses on the first 7 books, which is fine, I suppose. Something else that's different about early on in the series is the goblins. So the size of the goblins is different. So in the first series, they were like 2 inches tall, 2 to 3 inches tall. They were the same size as the fairies, which made sense. But then it didn't make sense because the girls are in the human world and they're just terrified of these 2-inch goblins. It was kind of ridiculous. Yeah, so the Weather Fairy series, Jack Frost cast a spell which made the goblins bigger, so the goblins are about at the size of the girls' shoulders. But the books weren't consistent on how tall the goblins were for quite some time, actually. It took them embarrassingly long to figure out how tall the goblins should be, even though, like I said, the second series made it clear they were a certain height. They still went back and forth between the goblins being large and the goblins being small. Like, not Jasmine the Present Fairy. India the Moonstone Fairy, goblins are tiny in that one. I don't know why. And then I think it was Grace the Glitter Fairy. Again, the goblin's like 3 inches tall. And also Jasmine the Present Fairy. So that's like 3 books in the Party Fairy series where the goblins are tiny. But the other books, the goblins, I think they're normal. So actually, I think they're small again in Cherry the Cake Fairy too. Doesn't one step in a cake or something? I don't know. The point is, it took them a while to realize the goblins should be about the same size as the girls, that's all. So, and the girls are about the same size as Jack Frost, but Jack Frost is taller than the goblins. The books were inconsistent also when it came to Jack Frost's castle and the goblins and stuff in Fairyland. Pretty much every single one of the special edition books had our heroes go to Jack Frost's ice castle, and you know, again, like the first third of the series was best because they put in more effort. And so the girls generally had to trick the goblins in order to get into the castle and then do another trick to get the magic item of the day. Whoa, 2 different tricks in one book. Can you believe it? That's way more effort than usual. Trust me. But eventually they just gave up on that, and it's like, oh, the window was open. The girls just flew in through the window. So, yeah. Anyway, my complaint was whenever they visit Jack Frost's castle, they're fairy-sized. They're like 3 inches tall, whereas the goblins are still human-sized, and Jack Frost is adult human-sized. And that didn't really make sense to me, why the girls would go to Jack Frost's castle. They could have gone in their normal human form, so they were the same size as everybody they meet, but no, they wanted to be tiny little fairies. And that doesn't make sense. And then, you know, they also showed the Goblin Grotto quite a bit in the series. I mean, not super often. And that just went back and forth between whether or not the fairies, whether the girls were the same size as the goblins or not. Sometimes they're little tiny fairies trying to stop goblins. In general, the girls turn into fairies in every single book. And sometimes that is just a chapter in itself, the girls turning into fairies. And I really disliked that. It's not a fun scene to read 100 times in a row, and it never makes sense. Oh, okay, sometimes it makes sense for them to be fairies. It's like, okay, we've got to reach a small spot, right? Well, then it makes sense for them to shrink themselves down and then turn into fairies. But then all the other books, they just make up the most ridiculous excuses. Like, oh, let's turn into fairies so we can fly through the mall. That does happen in several books. Oh man, I think that was the Fashion Fairy series. But like, they're supposed to keep fairies a secret, and they're not supposed to let anybody be seen, right? Nobody's supposed to see them as fairies, and yet they keep insisting on turning into fairies into crowded areas. That's dumb. Another dumb thing is they insist that they can travel faster as fairies, which makes no sense, because the goblins are human-sized. Like, if I was in a race with a butterfly, I would win. I don't know why the girls think, oh, well, obviously the butterfly can fly faster than a running goblin. It doesn't make sense that they think they're faster when they're fairies, and yet they keep using that excuse. So they generally turn into fairies so they can see what's going on. and because they think it'll be faster, even though it makes no sense. It would be better if they stayed as human size. Really, half the time they should just defeat the goblins by tackling the goblins. I know violence is not encouraged in little children's books like these, but the girls just could have tackled every single goblin they met, ripped the magic item from the goblin's hands, and then that's it. That could have been how they defeated the goblins. Another thing that annoyed me is when they overlook an obvious solution or an easy way to get the magic item because there's still like 2 chapters left in the book, and they're not allowed to defeat the goblins until chapter 5 or even chapter 6 in some cases. That's what the formula says. They can't stop the goblin in chapter 3. And so we'll have a situation like this where, oh man, I'm about to touch the magic item. Pretend this book is a magic item. I'm about to touch it. And then a goblin runs across the street, grabs the book, and runs away. The goblin somehow manages to beat them, even though the goblin's running from a really long distance. And they're fairies. They're like 2 inches away. And the goblin beats them to it. That happens way too much, where the girls just stand around and do nothing while the goblins rob them. And that's just... Yeah. So, with defeating the goblins, there were several ideas. Like, one of them was food. They would give the goblins food, and that got phased out as the series went on. That used to be like every single series had like defeating the goblins with food, and then every series had one where the goblins defeated themselves. Basically, the goblins got into a fight over something dumb, and they would drop the magic item themselves and leave. And that was really convenient for the girls whenever that happened. There's also trick the goblins by trading, and that used to be clever and creative in the first third of the series. So like it's not Daisy the fairy. Daisy, I forget what the Daisy fairy is. No, the Daisy fairy was the one where they made daisy chains. Yeah, I mean, they made daisy chains in the daisy. So that was one of the weird books, was the petals, the flower petal series, because in that book they do talk to a human girl and tell her, hey, fairies are real, will you please help us? And she says, sure, I'll help you. And then that's never mentioned again. They totally break the rule that you never tell any humans about fairies. And that's it. They just kind of ignore that for the rest of the series. I thought that was really weird and strange. Anyway, what was the point I was making? Something about the goblin. Oh yeah, okay, so we need to fool the goblins. So, They wanted to fool the goblins by making the goblins think the magical item doesn't work. Let's just use the sports fairies, because I'm remembering that. So, we've got a magic basketball, which makes you good at basketball. So they have to trick the goblins into thinking the magic basketball doesn't work. Hey, this is a basketball that works. Will you trade our basketball for your basketball? So they basically trick the goblins into trading the useful magic item for a worthless item. And I think it was one of the Flower Fairy books where it's like, okay, hey, you've got this flower. Well, we've got a flower which is 3 times as large. Will you trade it for us? And the goblins go, yeah, sure. And that's sort of how it worked early on in the series, where at least they put some effort into it. They had to trick the goblin into thinking the item wasn't working, so the goblins would be willing to trade. This morphed into, we have to create something yucky for the goblins, because goblins are yucky, so we're gonna make them disgusting marshmallows. Those are called bog mallows. Those show up in many books. Also, pogwurzels show up in many books. Goblins are scared of pogwurzels, which is just a made-up creature. So in several books, the girls defeat the goblins by pretending pogwurzels are around. Yeah. And then, like I said, several books, it's just, they make something goblin-like. So it's like, oh, they have a magic book? Well, here's a green book. Or, here's a smelly version of the magic item. Or, here's a green. it just really got lazy and turned into, here's a green version of the magic item. Will you trade? And the goblins are like, sure, I'll give away this totally useful magic item for your useless green old sock. And yeah, yeah, I think another trick they used over and over again, which got old quickly, was having the girls turn into goblins, and that got old quickly. And all of the artwork was inconsistent about what the girls looked like when they were goblins, which is kind of a pain. Let's see. For the longest time, there were only like 2 people. So with the first part of the series, there were like 4 different people writing these books. And eventually it got to be 2, and they just traded off book after book after book. And I think Sue, she was the one who quit the series, and then they brought on Rachel to replace her, and then I think her name is Narinder. Give me a second. There's like a 50-50% chance. Okay, this book was written by Sue. It's like a 50-50 chance. Yep, Narinder. I was right, Narinder. Oh, I'm dropping my books. Well, you know I'm talking about Rainbow Magic Fairy at this point anyway. You don't need to see the book in the background. And so then Narinder dropped out of the series like 1 or 2 series later. And then that sort of just left Rachel holding the ball, and then she wrote every single book after that. There were some she didn't write. There were a couple of US exclusive books. But really, it was just all her. And one of the decisions, I don't know if she made it or if somebody else did, but one of the decisions made around that time was the series will go from 7 books to 4 books. Every series only has 4 books instead of 7. And I think that really hurt the Rainbow Magic Fairy series. Just in general, the quality of the books seemed to dip at that point. So, one of the problems was, as I believe I mentioned, they tried to have 2 Jack Frost books per series. Well, it doesn't work. 3 actually. It doesn't work. I mean, it worked fine when there were 7 books for a series where you only see Jack Frost in the first book and in the grand finale. Maybe you see him in book number 4. Maybe. That works just fine. But when it's a 4-book series, it's like, okay, you see him in book 1, you see him in book 3, and you see him in book 4. You see him in 75% of the books, which totally takes away from the effectiveness of Jack Frost being the grand finale, the big scary villain. So, yeah, that was a problem. Yeah. And let's see, what else can I talk about? Did I talk about the British exclusives? Yeah, I mean, I mentioned American exclusive books. There are plenty of British exclusive books too, and those were different. So, like the American exclusive books, they tended to be the special edition books. They tended to be the extra large special edition books, like this. But they were not always. The British. There's a couple of American exclusives, which I think was with the Fairy Tale Fairies series, where like that. I forget the others. Anyway, maybe Candy Fairies. I read over 200 of these books. Okay, I don't have all of them memorized. I'm sorry. Anyway. With the UK exclusive books, those were mostly just one-shot books. So they were just 60-page books. They weren't like the American exclusives, which tended to be special edition books. So they tended to be a bit longer. But they're called the one-off series. So most of them were based on the royal family, if you can believe it or not. So there's like a book for Queen Elizabeth's Jubilee, and then there was a book for the royal wedding, and then 3 or 4 books when babies were born into the royal family, and then another one for the royal wedding. And then we had a couple of books with there were 2 books with Tiana, the Toy Fairy, which was based on a YouTuber, and then books based on like trends, like loom bands and fidget spinners, and then boy bands, and that sort of stuff. So I read some of them, but really the only difference between them, they tried a little harder with those books, but there wasn't a huge difference between those and just a normal entry in the series. Let's see what else. Rachel and Kirsty, those girls tend to have very little personality too, besides just being easily fooled. They're supposed to be smart because they're always fooling goblins, but goblins are really easy to fool. Something that's inconsistent about the books is whether or not they can talk to animals, because sometimes the animals talk and sometimes the animals don't. Eventually the series decided no, animals don't talk unless there's a fairy spell cast on the girls. Which is fine. I mean, it breaks established continuity, but at least they made up a standard and then they stuck to it, which was not the case when it came to the sizes of the characters. Yeah. Queen Titania and King Oberyn appear every now and then. They're fine, I guess. The queen has a magic seeing pool, and every now and then they'll just look in her magic seeing pool and see what happened, where the magic items are. In which case, why do they even need Rachel and Kirsty? Really, at any time the fairies can look in the queen's seeing pool and know where the missing magic items are, and they could just go there and get the magic items. It's really, there's no reason to bring Rachel and Kirsty into it. Now, one question a lot of people have is, why does Jack Frost keep showing up where Rachel and Kirsty are? You know, if Jack Frost went to a completely different country, it would be very hard for Rachel and Kirsty to stop him. But no matter where Rachel and Kirsty are, even when they're on vacation, and they tend to be on vacation a lot, Jack Frost just happens to send his goblins there. So the counter argument is that the fairies would instantly transport the girls to wherever they needed to be. We saw that in like the Baby Animal Rescue Fairy series, where they had to go to Africa, or you know, other countries, like they went to the Caribbean, I believe, and also in the Ocean Animals fairies, where they went to Antarctica. So we did get cases where Jack Frost did like try to hide magical objects somewhere else in the world, but the fairies would just warp the girls to wherever they need to be, because the fairies would say, oh, I can sense my magic object is nearby. That was always something which annoyed me, because they didn't really know where the magic object was, but they could kind of sense it. And the books were really inconsistent about how good their sensing skills were, and that was kind of annoying. Another thing that's kind of annoying is the girls could never recognize the goblins. The goblins have green skin, they have giant feet, and giant noses. They should be really easy to spot, and yet every single time it takes the girls a really long time to notice the goblins are nearby, which is ridiculous, especially in the case of it's like, oh, the goblins were here at the festival for the past 5 books. Do you think the goblins are at the festival today? Yes, of course they are. Another thing about the earlier part of the series, the first like 50 or so books trying, is they tried to make an excuse for why the items were in the fairy. So the story is Jack Frost stole like all the fairy magic objects, and the magic objects are lost somewhere in the human world. They tried to come up with an excuse for why these items are not in Jack Frost's castle. Why didn't he just shove all the magic items under his bed in the ice castle? Well, it would have made for a really boring book series if the girls went to the ice castle every single book, right? Another thing that kind of bothers me is that, you know, every book takes place in a different day. There are some exceptions, but in general, every book is a completely different day. It's like, why do the girls limit themselves to one magic item per day? That makes no sense. Like, why can't they, especially in the special editions, like this book, where there are 3 magic items. It's like, you could find more than one magic item per day. You don't have to sit and wait. But instead, with these special fairy edition books, what happens is they find magic item number 1, and the fairy just goes away and then comes back the next day. It's like, hello, I thought 3 of your magic objects were missing. Why do you not care about finding the other 2? And oftentimes the fairy would just come up to the girls and say, hey, I figured out where my magic item is. I heard a rumor. It's in Spain. And I'm like, well, really, how did you know where the magic item is? She probably used the magic seeing pool, but they rarely say that's the case because because the author always prefers to have the girls go to fairyland and look in the magic seeing pool because that's a good chapter and a half. Yeah, a lot of these books feel like the author was just having, I wouldn't say struggling to meet a word count, but it's definitely the case that these books have a lot of filler, which is surprising because they're so short and you already have like one chapter of recap. But there's definitely a lot of places where it's just pointless filler. We're just wasting pages. Yeah. One of their favorite ways to do that is the girls almost defeat the goblins, but the goblins run away. That's it. And they're in the exact same spot they were afterwards. Something else the series was inconsistent about was how did the goblins disguise themselves? And some of the books said, well, Jack Frost just in general cast a glamour charm on the goblins so other humans don't recognize them. Other books, it's they have to try to prevent humans from recognizing the goblins. And then most of the books, it's just a combination of humans are just kind of dumb and don't recognize the fact that they're talking to green-skinned creatures, which I feel like is ridiculous. Yeah. Like Jack Frost, the goblins start off as more of a serious threat, but then they just become joke characters. They're just selfish and mean and foolish and fight all the time. And that's basically just the personality of every single goblin. There is rarely an attempt to make one goblin seem different from the others. Usually they'll say, okay, here's the goblin with the large ears, or the goblin with the warty nose. Something like that. The tall goblin, the shortest goblin. But they rarely are given personalities and seem different. It makes me wonder if Rachel and Kirsty are just running into the same three goblins all the time, or if they meet a different goblin every single time. It's rare for a goblin to actually recognize the girls. So that's odd. You think the goblins would get used to it. Eventually Jack Frost recognizes the girls every single time. You're the girls who always foil my plans, he says in one of the books. Yeah. So where was I? Going back to what I was trying to say, they tried to make an excuse for why Jack Frost did not hide the items in Fairyland, and sometimes that was good, sometimes it wasn't. So I think for a while it was okay. His spell to get rid of the magic items failed, and that's why the magic items ended up in the human world, and he sent his goblins to retrieve them. In one book, the goblins wanted to steal the magic items for themselves. So in several of the books, it's just, the girls and the goblins are both looking for the lost fairy item. That works fine. And then later on in the series, they just don't even bother with that. And it's just the goblins have the magical items. The goblins are in the human world, right next to Rachel and Kirsty. Rachel and Kirsty just have to defeat the goblins, that's all. So I think I've said everything I want to say about the rainbow magic. I've been talking forever. These books are dull. These books are repetitive. If you've read one book, you've read them all. And, there are some books which are unique and interesting, some books which are funny, but for the most part, they're just boring and repetitive. And it's a good series for people are just learning to read. It's very simple, lots of pictures, but man, these books are dull. I just don't like them. And I've read all of them. So I've read over 200 of these books. The series is still going in the United Kingdom, so it's not over, but they did finish in the United States. The last book was, the last series was like the Sweet Fairy series. So, more candy fairies. And then it was followed by the Mermicorn Fairy, Evelyn the Mermicorn Fairy. So that was the last, most recent rainbow magic book published in the United States. And that was 2017. So, I doubt we're going to get any more rainbow magic fairy books. Yeah. Oh, Another thing, Rachel and Kirsty don't live anywhere near each other. They live in different towns. One lives in Weatherbury, and then, you know that because it's the Weather Fairy series. That was the second series. And the other one was Tippington Town, right? And the girls are constantly going on vacation and visiting each other. I feel like one of the things they would have done if they had to reboot the series, if they could go back and change things, how would they make the series better? Well, 6 books per series, have Rachel and Kirsty live in the same town. You know, I think those would be 2 big ways. Also get like figure out the formula. Or maybe not. Like I said, the first 30 to 50 books were interesting because they tried things, they did things differently, they played with the formula because they didn't have the formula set in stone yet. And so I feel like if they could go back in time and redo the series, they would have that formula dead set from the very beginning. Yeah. So, I mean, I would change the formula too. Like I said, there are some tweaks. Like they started out with trying to fool the goblins with a lot of animal scares, like the dog. I think it's Rachel's dog or it's Kirsty's dog, Buttons, would scare the goblins. So that was a scare that happened a lot. And then the dog just completely disappears and never gets mentioned again in the series. Same with the other girl's cat. The cat was not like a major character or anything, but the cat completely disappeared. And the series is constantly like making up new relatives for the girls to meet for the sake of the story. Yeah. So, oh, also the parents. The parents. I think the artist got the parents mixed up at some point because Rachel has blonde hair and Kirsty has dark hair. But Kirsty's parents both have blonde hair, while Rachel's parents both have dark hair. I feel like it would have made sense if we had a family of 3 blondes and then a family of 3 brunettes, rather than 2 brunettes with a blonde kid and 2 blondes with a brunette kid. Yeah, that's possible. That is possible, but it still always looks like the parents traded daughters at some point. Not to be mean, but yeah. Art's okay. The original artist eventually left the series fairly early on, I think. She left the series. She continued doing the cover art. Yeah. Anyway, I think that's it for the Rainbow Magic Fury series. In general, I think I give them a sideways thumbs up, or on the edge of a thumbs down, really. There were plenty of books that were good, which I thought were great. You know, that has to be the case when they've got over 200 books. Not every book is terrible. Some of them are better than others. But just in general, just boring and repetitive. Just, you know, if you have to, just read one of the series, and then you've got a good sense of what every single series is like, okay? Those are my thoughts on Rainbow Magic Fury series. Overall, I'm just really glad that I'm finished with the series and I never have to read these books again. Thank you for watching, everyone.